I want to show you one of my favorite moments in Outer Wilds, and it has to do with that explosion right there. But I'll get to that in a little bit. Before I really jump into things, I do want to give that obligatory spoiler warning that everyone likes to do at the beginning of Outer Wilds videos. I won't be talking about major spoilers, and really if you know the core mechanic of the game already, I don't think watching this will have a dramatic impact on your experience playing it. I will talk about a few bits of lore that are learned throughout the game, but most of them are learned pretty early, and I don't think anything is all that consequential. With that said, I am obviously talking about a part of the game that was very meaningful to me, and you might want to experience that for yourself. So what I'm saying is do what makes sense to you. A big reason people love Outer Wilds so much is there are so many incredible revelations throughout the game. I very much understand anyone who would want to be protective over these moments, because they're kind of what makes Outer Wilds Outer Wilds. The way the game handles revelations is why people are still talking about it to this day. And you'd think that one of these revelations would be the sort of thing I'd want to make a video about. But really, this video isn't about a revelation, at least not one about any major secrets of the game. It is about the lack of one. And that brings me back to the explosion of the orbital probe cannon. For those who might not know or remember, the orbital probe cannon was built by the Nomai, the alien race that inhabited the solar system before you and the other Earthlings. And it was built with one goal in mind: finding the eye of the universe. At the beginning of each loop, it shoots a probe into a random direction, and it utilizes the same technology that the Nomai statues use, that allow you as a player to retain your memories. That probe, which is the thing I am currently shooting right past, collects data and transmits it back to the probe tracking module. It is clear from very early on that there is some valuable information within the probe tracking module, but as that module gets blown off of the cannon during the probe's launch, one of the core mysteries of the game ends up being about finding where the tracking module went, and even more importantly, how to get to it. For the longest time, I didn't really think about the probe itself. I was just so focused on finding the tracking module. But that changed when something very important happened in my playthrough, which was that I got utterly and completely stuck. I had no idea what to do next. I had followed all these threads, but I couldn't put things together for some reason. And that's really how the core gameplay loop of Outer Wilds often goes, is you have all these things collected, but you don't know exactly what the secret is. You don't know what brings it all together. And maybe that's because you just haven't spent enough time thinking about it, or maybe it's because you haven't found enough context through the Nomai writing to know what to do with the information you have. But regardless, when you're in one of those moments, that is when you come up with the wildest and potentially worst ideas of how to solve things. After a particularly terrible loop where I learned absolutely nothing, I looked up at the explosion and at the probe shooting out of the cannon and thought to myself, wouldn't it be genius if the most important piece of information, the one I've been looking for, the thing I need, was somehow on that probe? So I went to my ship and flew after it. Of course, that loop I couldn't find it. It was lost among the various blue stars that are in the universe, but after a couple tries, I was able to follow it. And I was pretty confident that this was the answer to all my questions. It almost made too much sense that it would have some sort of information about the eye or the tracking module, so there was nothing left to do than to grab my suit and go out into space. When I had been circling the probe in my ship, I didn't notice any sort of Nomai writing or really anything obvious that I could interact with, but I was still hopeful that on a closer inspection I'd find something. Of course, the truth of it that I would soon learn is that there isn't anything to be found on the probe. It is just another one of Outer Wilds' many dead ends. I could tell pretty quickly that all of this was fruitless, but that didn't stop me from trying various things. I inspected every inch of the probe, hoping that there would be something, anything, to make this trip worth it. I had gone from being positive that I was about to figure something out to realizing that I was even further away than I thought. But I didn't want to give up. and I was willing to do any stupid thing in the hopes of getting the probe to have some sort of reaction. I knew nothing would work, but I tried anyway. When it came to most of my other failures in Outer Wilds, I usually walked away being like, yeah, of course that wouldn't work. But this one had felt different. This seemed like the perfect place to stash away some information, and there was just nothing at all, except a useless hunk of rock and space. Of course, this is the beauty of Outer Wilds. You fail until you don't anymore. This was just another one of those failures. I didn't want to admit it right away, and I spent far longer than I needed to proving to myself that I had been wrong. But that's all part of the process. I think it's part of why I like this game so much. Reflection is sort of built into the gameplay loop, and being deep in the middle of space alongside a probe that had taught me absolutely nothing, I had more than enough time to reflect. I imagine after hearing me say all of this, some of you are thinking, bro, it's just a video game. And yeah, of course it's just a video game. But games are designed to elicit specific reactions from players. And I think based on the amount of people who have had an emotional reaction to Outer Wilds, certain aspects of its design were clearly intended to get players to think about things, to feel some kind of way. And this can be seen through its general theming, its use of space, and I think its overall aesthetic. And while I'm sure they didn't expect every player to chase down the probe, I imagine they thought some might, and they probably wanted that experience to feel a certain way. They wanted those players to notice something, to feel something, to get value out of a loop where they won't solve anything. When you're out here, things are less hectic, they're quieter, making it easier to notice things. For instance, when looking out at other stars, it is very clear that many are going supernova. This is something you can observe anywhere in Outer Wilds, but when out here, it's much more obvious. And you realize that this event, this thing that keeps happening, your sun exploding over and over, it isn't isolated. It isn't just you. The universe is bigger than you can ever imagine, and you'll never truly understand it. Once I had completely confirmed what I already knew, a new question arose of what to do next. At this point, I was certainly too far away from the solar system to make it back before the sun went supernova, but there was no real reason mechanically to stay out here. I had followed it, and there was nothing to learn. But then a small little thought occurred to me of what if? What if there is something to learn? What if this probe takes me where I need to go? What if it gets me to the eye of the universe? What if this is the one that will find it? Or what if it just finds something else? Again, just like before, I knew this wouldn't be anything. I knew this wouldn't lead to anything. But I also knew I didn't want to be the guy who gave up digging just before hitting buried treasure. So as it only would really cost me about 15 minutes and no actual money, I decided I would fly on. I would keep along the probe to see if anything with it changed, and to see if it found what I was looking for, or something new. This did mean I would have to figure out how to spend my time, as there are only so many ways to fly around a probe. So I just started observing things, one of them being my actual ship, which is something I pretty much always took for granted. When I first got the launch codes, I didn't inspect it in any meaningful way. I was just excited to take off and see what things were like, so I did just that. And it wasn't until this point that I actually appreciated the thing that was getting me everywhere. The design of the ship, the combination of Nomai technology, typical rocket parts, and of course planks of wood is just so unique. You can tell it was built on timber hearth, and where most people associate spaceships with a sort of sterile feel, this one feels cozy. It feels like home. And after being stranded because I had decided to follow a lead that led to absolutely nothing, this was a nice comfort to have. Now, to fully understand why Outer Wilds and this specific experience of following the probe meant so much to me, I have to jump into what my life was like during that time. I played it back in October of 2019, which was an extremely transitional period for me. I had just moved states, pretty much going from a city where I had friends to hang out with all the time to one where opportunities for that sort of thing were fewer and farther between, and found myself feeling pretty lonely. And I didn't really know how to adjust to the change. Of course, instead of actually trying something that might help, I just didn't. When you're frustrated about a big change, it's so easy to not do anything to help you through it. I could have been better about reaching out to friends, and I could have found things to do, but that stuff took effort, and for whatever reason, I wasn't willing to do that. In fairness, making friends when you're past high school or college is very difficult. Like, how do you meet new people? Genuinely, let me know if you have an answer, because it's been really hard to figure that out since becoming an adult. There are just fewer opportunities to get to know strangers and potentially create friendships. The only way I know how to make friends now is by meeting other people in the video space, and that's great. It is awesome to get to chat with tons of different folks who are like-minded, who are interested in the same things I am, but there is obviously a difference between hanging out in person and talking in Discord chats. That's not saying one is inherently better than the other, but I think you need a balance of all types of communication. To be clear, it wasn't like I was entirely isolated. I spent plenty of time with the wonderful lady I live with, and I still saw friends and family a fair bit. It's just that the balance had shifted. It wasn't the same as it once was, and I found myself spending far more time on my own. And I don't want this to come off as me advocating that anytime you're feeling lonely, you should just play video games instead of seeking out social interactions, because you need social interactions. It is part of being a human, but I will say Outer Wilds helped me confront some of the loneliness I was feeling. One of the more memorable instances of this happening occurred when I looked back at my original solar system and pointed my signal scope at it. There's nothing like being far away from your friends that reminds you of how good the good times were. The reality is those times never truly existed. There was always some strife, there was always some issue, but distance and time smooth those things away, and we're left with the sense that it used to be so much easier, that getting the band together had no real obstacles. And now I have friends who I used to see every day spread all across the country, and the vast majority of our time is not spent playing a song together, but playing our own individual parts, which sometimes align with what other people are doing, but usually don't. There's something about a metaphor discovered through an organic gameplay moment that just makes it hit. After spending so much time missing friends, it meant a lot to have pretty much exactly how I felt be reflected back at me. To be seen in such a specific way from a moment that could easily be missed helped me feel a bit better. Of course, it didn't teach me how to adapt to the ways friendships change over time, and it didn't get me to find out the best way to maintain or forge new ones, but it did give me a little bit of peace during a time that I needed it. The other big thing going on during my life at this point was that I had just put out what games are like for someone who doesn't play games, which I don't know how many of you were around at that point, but that video went wildly viral. Over the course of a week, the video got like 3 or 4 million views, and the channel grew by over 100,000 subscribers. This level of traffic typically doesn't happen with video essays about games, so I was at a complete loss as to why the video was spreading as much as it was. I remember there was 1 hour-long period where the video got over 80,000 views, and you'd think that I'd be really excited about that, and I was to a degree, but I also felt sick to my stomach. It was so overwhelming to know that that many people were watching the video, that many people were hearing my voice, seeing me joke around with my wife, making judgments about me, making judgments about her, and it just was so much noise. The vast majority of it was positive, but when you're getting millions of views and thousands of comments, even if just 0.1% of people are negative, that's still a ton of people. I had dreamed for years of having the channel blow up, but when it actually happened, I was not prepared for it. There's just so much input happening that even the positive comments stressed me out. And I always felt weird talking about it because no one really wants to hear a guy who's having a lot of success on YouTube complain about it. Ultimately, this was a good thing and something that I'm really fortunate happened, but it was a lot to deal with and something I had to learn how to adjust to. What made it all even weirder is before I put Gaming for a Non-Gamer out, I was planning to take a step back from YouTube because I was about to go broke. Over the course of that previous year, I had been making a concerted effort to turn YouTube into my job. Throughout that time, I was working alongside Jesse Garasha, a very talented editor and producer, and we were doing everything we could to grow the channel. We had a decent bit of success. A few videos took off, and whenever that would happen, there would be a lot of hope that this could become the thing. But that was almost always followed by a video underperforming massively, and it was usually ones that we thought would do really well. Despite all of our effort, the channel wasn't sustainable, so it was time to find a consistent way to make money, which meant getting normal jobs. During that year, there were many times I considered quitting YouTube, but this was the first time that I actually felt like I needed to. My bank account was about to hit zero, so I needed to figure out whatever was going to be next. I had come to terms with the fact that I would never be a YouTuber, but then Gaming for a Non-Gamer, a video that I told multiple friends that I didn't think anyone would be all that interested in, proved me wrong. Obviously, I was happy about all of this, but it also was beyond overwhelming. I had geared myself up to move on, so for the channel to receive a response as big as it did, my brain just couldn't handle it. I didn't know how to shift from practically giving up to figuring out how we could best capitalize on the momentum. The right path forward wasn't clear to me, and Outer Wilds was my retreat from all of this. I wanted something I could solve, and in Outer Wilds there is always an answer. Sometimes it's hard to find, but with enough consideration, you can find it. For a while, I was obsessed with uncovering every bit of information I could. Any run where I didn't find a new clue felt like a run wasted. And it wasn't until I decided to follow the probe into the depths of space that I realized that Outer Wilds is not a game that you need to optimize. Not every moment needs to lead to something, and the experience of Outer Wilds is a fleeting one. Once you beat it, there's no going back. So it's important to enjoy the time you have in it where you don't know everything that's going on, where you don't have all the answers, and you're still trying to figure it out. For me, following the probe acted as a reminder to sometimes take a breath and slow things down, to not get so swept up in things, whether that be mysteries or newfound attention. To be clear, this moment and just playing Outer Wilds in general didn't solve anything. I still get swept away in things, I still have a lot of anxiety. Those sorts of things don't just go away because you have a moment of clarity, but it did help me feel better, and it also got me to reflect on things. The reality was, when it came to the channel, I didn't know what I was doing, and when I was put in a situation where I felt like I should, it led to being overwhelmed. I learned though that I didn't need to have it all figured out, and that some things were just impossible to figure out. Like, humans weren't designed to read thousands of comments every single day. It is too much information to take in and engage with. And if I spent all of my time trying to overcome these impossible tasks, I would lose the thing that got me into all this in the first place. So as I followed the probe, instead of worrying about what might come next, I just appreciated what I had. I like to hang on to moments like these, the ones that bring about some sort of peace. Whether it comes from a game or other form of media or just real life, being able to look back at times where I felt a sense of calm, where I was able to set aside the stresses of my life for a moment to just be, means a lot to me. Because that is far from my natural state. So I try whatever I can to remember them, to be able to tap into them, to use them as a tool to remember that I need to be present. And with Outer Wilds specifically, that is very easy, because this entire memory, the one of me following the probe and learning nothing but being okay with that, is tied to the song playing right now, Space. It's a song that I had heard many times throughout my playthrough of Outer Wilds, but it was always in short chunks because I was only ever flying places for 1 to maybe 2 minutes. This run was the first time I heard it play in its entirety. It went from being a song I almost never thought about because I was usually more focused on my destination to one of my favorite tracks in the entire game, which says a lot because this soundtrack is incredible. It is now one of my go-to songs if I need to feel a sense of calm, if I need to be reminded that it's okay to settle down a bit. It makes me think about this loop where I followed the probe and found so much peace despite learning nothing. It's the kind of loop that you'd expect me to find disengaging. In fact, I'm still kind of surprised that I wasn't checking my phone the entire time waiting for the loop to end. Instead, I just waited and thought about the ideas that the game was presenting to me and was just happy to be playing it. Outer Wilds disrupted the way I typically play games. I like to finish things. My biggest motivation while playing a game is to beat it. That's what drives me. I don't necessarily like that I'm like this, but it is the general tendency I have. So whenever I find a title that pushes against that, and it actually gets me to slow down and appreciate the mere act of playing, it sticks with me, and it becomes a part of how I cope with the world. I assume many of you have picked up from my videos that there is a lot going on in my head at all times. I am a chronic overthinker, and it is rare for me to fall out of that pattern. So it's easy to adore the things that get me to. By this point, any pretense of the probe leading me somewhere important had been dropped. It wasn't why I was following it anymore. I didn't care that it was all for nothing. Really, I just wanted to see it all through to the end. One of the major themes in Outer Wilds explored through both its gameplay and story is that there's an inevitability to the universe. While we are all a part of it and have some influence over it, certain things will happen. And as the universe is so big and impossible to understand, life will present us with more things that are out of our control than things that are in it. And this has been one of the hardest things for me to deal with throughout my life. There are so many things out of my control that it's overwhelming, and I can't help but try to control them, to push against things that will never budge. The aspects of my life that are out of my control are far easier to focus on than those that are, because something about them feels cosmically unfair, and that is the lot we all have in life. Things happen despite us wanting them to or not, and the universe doesn't care how you feel about it. And it's not fair, but that doesn't change anything. There will always be things bigger than us that are out of our control. This doesn't mean that we should just submit to it all, but rather that we should figure out the ways in which we can have an effect, to observe what we can about how all of this works, and forge the part that we want to play in it, because the universe is. And we are. Most of the time when the events of a loop are played back to you, they show tons of different things you discovered and experienced. But with this one, it's mostly just pictures of the probe from different angles. By just looking at it, it'd be easy to assume that not much was gained by this run. But in reality, it is the loop that truly got me to fall in love with Outer Wilds. It didn't give me answers about the game itself, but it gave me exactly what I needed to be ready for whatever would come next.